So I know Savannah has to go to another meeting in Oldham County real quick, so I'm gonna give a short introduction of who we are and then give her a chance to speak. The Tea Party basically stands for traditional American values. We think that the government has a role to play, and it is to protect life, liberty, and property. We know, as George Washington said, that government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. And we think that we ought to restrict the amount of force that's being used against the people. The bigger the government, the smaller the citizen. The more power the government has, the less power you have as an individual. So we know that we certainly don't want anarchy where there is no law and there is no government, but we also don't want the overreach where government abuses its power and becomes a thief and becomes, the raid of President Trump's property was a pretty good example of what happens when government gets out of control and overreaches. And we're not for that as a Tea Party. We're for limited government, as the Constitution says, and we want a limited government that works for the people, not the other way around. I guess that's pretty much to give you a brief. Well, also, we think that the law applies to everyone equally. There should be no difference based on race, based on religion, based on anything. We all should have equal justice under the law.
Based on political party?
Based on political party, yes. We shouldn't have a two-tiered system of justice. So, with that, Savannah, would you please come on up here? We have been so impressed with her. And we're so glad that she's running for governor. She has been a steadfast protector of our liberty through the whole COVID mess, and we really appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is really a privilege to be here with you tonight, and I'm especially excited because this microphone is actually at a good height for me. More often than not, whenever I come to an event, you'll find me that one of the first things I do is take that microphone right off, and I'll usually dance around with it a little bit if there's a podium that's right up to my chin. But too often, politicians want people to pay attention to the things that they say and not to what they do. And if there's one thing that you take out of the things that I say this evening, one thing that is important for me to note is that I have a track record to back up everything that I am telling you. From the time that I was first entrusted to serve in public office in the Kentucky General Assembly, I have a voting record, and no different than any other candidate coming to you and asking for you to put your trust in them to lead, I encourage you to really look at who people say they are versus what they have done. And the entire time that I've been in office, I have always cast every vote in the General Assembly with the rationale that it is my responsibility to be a representative of the people and to be willing to explain why I do what I do. The next thing that I want you to bear in mind is that, in all likelihood, Kentucky's next governor is going to be a Republican. We know that we have supermajorities of 105 out of 138 in the General Assembly are occupied by Republicans. We know that we now, as of 2 or 3 weeks ago, have a majority of registered Republican voters. The question becomes, will Kentucky's next governor be a Ron DeSantis type Republican who will fight for your constitutional rights and liberties? Or is there going to be another go along to get along moderate fence sitting Republican like Mike DeWine or like Mitch McConnell? Is it going to be somebody who will easily compromise on the subject of red flag laws? I'm sure you all have been paying attention to what's transpired at the federal level. Not one other gubernatorial candidate was willing to speak publicly and on record in opposition to red flag laws, whereas I have. I've filed a resolution opposing the adoption of red flag laws since 2019, because that is what authentic Republicans do. And I think that that's where we're at this moment in time, at this moment in history. I am very concerned about the Kentucky that my two children are growing up in. They're 10 and 12 years old. Their names are Levi and Laura. They're on these little pamphlets that I've kind of passed out everywhere here. I'm worried about the Kentucky that they're growing up in. I'm worried about the America that they're growing up in, because it is not the same place that I grew up in. And I'm not just talking about the fact that we're dealing with rampant inflation, high gas prices, that the far left wants us to believe that children can change their gender just as easily as they could change their socks, that virtually every underpinning and fabric of our American way of life has been questioned, that the proliferation of socialism and indoctrination that has taken place in our school systems. I'm concerned about all of those things. And right now is the time that we need authentic Republicans. It's not enough to have an R beside your name, but authentic Republicans who are willing to put their foot down and stand firm on principle. That is exactly what I have done. And I want to give you probably the most elucidating example of that, dating back to March of 2020, whenever Andy Beshear issued a state of emergency and started shutting down our businesses and our churches and our schools. Not even a week had passed in March of 2020 where I filed an amendment to rein in his executive power, to try to put a stop to his tyrannical overreach right then, right there. And at that time, I was castigated, not just by the left, not just by the media, but even by some Republicans who somehow thought that it was reckless to stand up for our Constitution. But folks, leaders lead even when it's not politically expedient or popular. And now you have a field of other Republicans who say that they want to take on Andy Beshear and they want to be your leader. They want to lead our Commonwealth and get it back on the path of prosperity. But I pose the question, where were they when the Kentucky State Police were writing down the license plates of churchgoers on Easter Sunday? Where were they when our children were being forced to wear masks, and in Jefferson County are still being forced to wear masks, despite the fact that the science is arbitrary and it's junk science? Where were they whenever people were being forced to receive a vaccine against their will? That's another bill that I filed to try to address this. Yes, I co-sponsored House Bill 51 with the mask situation. Unfortunately, that did not pass out of the Senate, but also House Bill 28, because I understand that it's not the appropriate role of government to force, or it's not the appropriate role of anybody to force a citizen to receive a vaccine against their will. And it was never the appropriate role of government to remove our ability to earn a wage and put food on our table for our family, or to keep us from worshiping the Lord. If there's one good thing that can come out of everything that we have been through over the course of the past 2 years, even though we're now paying the price for that overreach, we're paying that price in the form of inflation, all those windfalls of federal dollars coming to shut down states, we're paying the price. But if there's one good thing that can come out of that, it's that people's eyes have been opened to the true cost of government overreach. This nebulous web of bureaucracy was always there. We just hadn't fully felt the full brunt of what that looked like until 2020 and 2021. We have to redefine the appropriate role of government in our lives to reflect the vision that the founders intended. That is going to take men and women of serious commitment and conviction, people who have courage to lead from the front. And I offer myself to you today as the individual that has that proven track record of leading from the front. It's going to take some difficult decisions to get our Commonwealth back on the path of prosperity. It's not going to be easy, but I do believe that we can do it if we're willing to put our foot down and stand firm in our convictions. Now, I've talked at you for quite a while, but if it is permissible in the format here, I would love to take questions from you. Yes, sir.
It's been my experience, every time a legislature, Congress, what have you, passes a law, it usually does two things. It costs us money, and it eats a little bit more into our freedom. I would ask that if you when you become governor, that you have somebody on your staff start digging through every law that you can find outmoded things that were passed 50 years ago and no longer apply, but they're still got people working there, and just try repealing something, anything, and you will probably save us money and give us a little bit more of our freedom back.
Yes, sir. That's a very, very good point that you've made there. And, you know, what would the legislature be doing if they weren't getting together and passing more and more and more new laws? I know the other day somebody had said something about how they wish we had a full-time legislature. I'm like, full stop, no, you don't. If anything, most of us should be afraid whenever the legislature gavels in, because that's the time that we're at risk for, like you say, having more regulations, having additional tax increases. But I think that one of the wonderful things that former Governor Matt Bevin did was the red tape reduction plan. He systemically, working with the legislature and with the cabinets, they identified a whole host of antiquated regulations that they were able to target and to get rid of. And frankly, whenever we talk about fostering greater economic growth, I think that it's important to remember that the best way to do that is to get government out of the way. Let the free market do what it should do without that undue interference and force from the government. So I think that that is a very good point. But, you know, on the subject of economic development, I think that one of the problems as well is our tax code. You know, the legislature has attempted to endeavor tax reform, but it's always been a function of, you know, cutting 0.5% or moving away from some type of production-based tax, but then just spreading it out to a different part of the tax code through consumption. And my plan as your next governor is going to be to engage in tax reform that is either revenue neutral or revenue negative, because you're not engaging in appropriate tax reform if you're just passing the cost on somewhere else. And it also has to coincide with meaningful cuts to wasteful spending, because we know that state government is bloated. We know that it's spending too much and it's too large. It's way over scale. So I think that in order to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we owe it to the citizens to do that. Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry, I missed the beginning, so you might have already answered this, but you mentioned free markets, you mentioned wasteful spending, some various things. So where do you stand on allowing the free market and the freedom of education for parents to decide the best learning environment for their children rather than the government deciding that for them?
Absolutely. I'm 100% in favor of school choice. I've co-sponsored that legislation and voted in favor of it each and every time. I think we're ultimately going to reach a point where we're going to need to look at the Constitution to make sure that money is following children and it's not funding systems. Recently, I discovered that now it's up to 15% of Kentucky students are either homeschooled or they're attending a private school. So, you know, it is certainly not antagonistic towards public schools to suggest that parents are the ones that know best how to educate their own children. And I think that that's also encompasses the types of things that they're learning even within the public school system. I am so sick and tired of people acting like our children belong to the state. They do not belong to the state.
So you would do something like what they just did in Arizona?
Within the context of Kentucky's Constitution, anything that is permissible legislatively, I think that we should pursue, and to the extent that there are hindrances within the Constitution, I'm open to looking at that as well. You know, I am not a person who is just willy-nilly, oh, open up the Constitution, but this is a very serious issue, and we need to create an environment where parents have the ability to choose.
Where do you stand on the pro-life, pro-choice issue?
I'm 100% and unapologetically pro-life. I think that the appropriate role of government is to protect life, liberty, and property, and I think that life begins at conception. So I have co-sponsored every single one of the pro-life bills that we have passed since I've been in office, and I was the primary co-sponsor of the constitutional amendment that we're going to be voting on in November. Everyone please show up and vote for Amendment 2 to the Kentucky Constitution. It will specify that there's nothing that can be interpreted to create a right to an abortion or funding therefore. Sir, I think you have it.
Since we have a supermajority in the Senate and the House, why aren't we repealing taxes now? Why aren't we repealing, all these laws that are overbearing? Why aren't we doing it?
Because we have a problem with spending. And I don't know how familiar you are with the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and the monumental influence that it has over the legislature, but the problem is they are willing to move away from production towards consumption-based taxes, which is good, you know, because think income, lower your income, but the problem becomes that they want to pass it along into service taxes. Like in 2018, what they did is they lowered the income, but then they arbitrarily picked 18 different service industries to apply that sales tax to, where it previously had not been. And then they did that again this past session. But in reality, that does nothing to address the fact that we have a spending addiction. We need to be cutting spending as well, because naturally, if you lower one tax, you're gonna have a hole in revenue. And they're just trying to look to different ways to make it up, whereas we need to be cutting the spending. A couple of ways that we need to be cutting spending. Kentucky has a 56% workforce participation rate among able-bodied adults. Think about that, folks. Able-bodied adults, only 56% of them are working. So certainly looking at our social assistance programs, making sure that they're solvent for the folks who really need them, but eradicating any waste and abuse and fraud that's transpiring, that's just one way. Because, you know, work is good. It's not just good for our coffers, it's good for your soul. And I think that we owe that to our citizens to make sure that we're rectifying that. And, you know, there are just a whole host of other areas that need to be cut as well. I know that former Governor Matt Bevin had talked about 6.5%. That was years ago, before we were even in the situation that we are. Also, the unfunded pension liability situation did not go away just because we don't have a governor that will talk about it. So, things to consider. Yes, sir.
Since my degree is in environmental protection, I would like to know what you think you can do to give us cleaner air, cleaner water. How are you going to deal with things like biosludge, radiation from 5G, and perhaps anything else you can think of?
I think the first question would be, to what extent is that the appropriate role of government to interfere with private industry in that way? And I think that a lot of those questions can, in certain circumstances, be better served at the local level, where you have more input from individuals. And I think that, if anything, the problem has been that we have allowed these nebulous webs of bureaucracy at the federal level to encroach upon what should have been the role of the state all along. Sir?
How are you going to combat the teachers' unions?
Combating the teachers' unions. The way you phrased the question, I think that the problem has become that teachers' unions have been employed for the purpose of advancing a partisan agenda. They're there not to advocate for the interests of the students, or frankly, not even necessarily for the interest of the teachers themselves, but
I know that. We know that. What are you going to do about it?
As far as combating them, I feel as though we have supermajorities in the legislature. Kentuckians have put their trust in Republicans to lead on the issues, including education, including on pension-related issues. It's just a function of leading and demonstrating to citizens that our vision and our leadership will prosper. That is the answer. It's not a function of trying to denigrate teachers or to pick fights with teachers. It's a function of showing that we have the ability to lead and then pushing forward with the message. There's no reason with the supermajority of 105 out of 138 that we should ever have to contend with those hyper-partisan realities that have been hindrances in the past. And you know, it's not lost upon me that there has been some fights that have been picked in the past, but again, I think that the way that leaders lead is leading from the front and on principle. Yeah.
Where do you stand on a curriculum transparency bill or parents' rights bill in education?
Yeah, no, I think that a parents' rights bill is much needed. We began the process of that last session, but there wasn't a whole lot of momentum. You'd be surprised to the extent that, like, the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and other entities are kind of opposed to those sorts of things. You'd think it would be the teachers' unions, but on that particular subject, it's actually been some other entities that you wouldn't think would be involved. But that said, I'm 100% supportive of that, because not only do parents know what's best for children, but these are taxpayer dollars that are being taken from us. So we should absolutely have that input, and our children don't belong to the state.
One of the things that we deal with a lot here, and I don't know if this can be fixed where you are, but I hope so, that dealing with traffic and capacity and safety, there's a lot of things that happen here that the local metro will point to Frankfurt and say traffic, safety is not considered. and building roads. And Frankfurt will point to Louisville, Louisville points to Frankfurt, and there's a constant, back and forth. And we really need safety standards to be in the KRS code, and it's not there. I'm wondering how, can something be done to put safety into standards so that state roads here have to abide by them before developers come in and start putting in 600, 700,000 houses on little country roads? Can something be done, and what can be done?
Well, in terms of passing the buck between a municipality and Frankfurt, that's not shocking to me. I think we see that quite a bit, unfortunately. But that said, when we're talking about major transportation projects, the SHIFT program is something that needs to receive a massive overhaul, in my opinion. I understand the impetus of it, what it was designed for, but I feel as though our ad districts have way too much influence over the input of our local governments. So I think that whenever you can bring everybody back to the table and not just give this arbitrary scoring power to unelected bureaucrats, you're gonna have a better product. Yes.
One of the things I see in the legislation which is passed, both at state level and even more so at federal, is that there are so many pages and so many words that they can be interpreted and twisted around to mean other than the basic intention. Is there any way that we can reduce the number of words used to define what we really want?
Well, I think that the first step would be to actually get the legislators to read the bills. Some of them do, some of them don't. And whenever you've got bills that are hundreds of pages long, if you shorten them to where they're actually something that they could read, they might fight you on that. But no, really, what you're referring to is the fact that the judiciary has taken creative license to an extreme extent with some of our legislation, and that's very problematic. I mean, we all know what the solution is to a rogue judiciary. We've got to elect new judges. Our Supreme Court, we've got to elect new Supreme Court justices, ones that did not agree with the decision to give Andy Beshear arbitrary power. But to your point, it absolutely should be simplified, because if your legislator cannot read and understand the totality of the bill and have the resources to understand what they're voting for, then they probably don't understand.
Absolutely.
Well, it seems like I'm up on time. I want to thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak. I have my cards out here if you want more information. Website is savannahforgovernor.com, and it's just a tremendous pleasure to speak with you today.